Look, Jacinta Price, a good friend of the program. She's the Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs. She also is with the Centre for Independent Studies, and she's done some brilliant work, a policy paper written for the Indigenous Research Program entitled Worlds Apart, Remote Indigenous Disadvantage in the Context of Wider Australia. I think it's a document that every Australian should read. I've had a look through it this morning. I'll peruse through all of the details today, but look, I want to summarise it with Jacinta this morning ahead of, well, unfortunately, again, a divisive Australia Day. Jacinta, good morning to you.
Good morning, Marcus.
It's really nice to catch up with you again. I trust you had a nice Christmas and New Year.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a lovely time. I hope you did as also.
We did. Thank you very much. Now, remote and very remote Indigenous communities have become victims of a wicked problem, you write, a combination of high impact factors that pulled together are having a devastating effect on Indigenous communities.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what it also highlights is the fact that the gap largely exists between Indigenous people living in remote and regional communities whose first language isn't English, who I guess more live in a more traditional context.
Yes.
And the rest of Australia, really, including other Indigenous Australians. The Indigenous Australians in cities do a lot better in terms of their lives in comparison to Indigenous people in remote communities.
I mean, I was very sad reading this. Education and employment rates in remote and very remote Indigenous communities put them on par with countries such as Afghanistan, a nation devastated by nearly 2 decades of conflict. Poor health outcomes, severe overcrowding in housing, more reminiscent of sub-Saharan Africa than one of the wealthiest nations on earth. We need to and we have to do a lot better, don't we?
Absolutely. And look, one of the biggest issues is the domestic violence issue across all states and territories where there's a population of more than 50% Indigenous. Domestic and family violence is either double the state or territory rate or more in some circumstances. For example, in the Northern Territory, domestic violence outstrips all other crimes in remote communities. So this is a huge issue that impacts the lives of Indigenous Australians and has a knock-on effect, when it comes to children with school attendance. School attendance is down to 82% nationally. It's 63% in the Northern Territory. And if you can't get an education, you're not able to take advantage of the world that is around you. And this isn't happening in remote communities.
No, well, that's absolutely right. And you say problems, including alcoholism, have contributed to the increase in domestic violence. There's an interconnection with, not only knowledge gaps, contradictory knowledge, varying views, economic burdens, etc. I mean, it all ends up in a wicked problem, as you write, and for decades, state, territory and Commonwealth governments have been trying and failing to solve the wicked problems besetting remote Indigenous communities. Billions upon billions of taxpayer dollars have been spent with very little improvement. In some communities, the situation has regressed. Alcohol abuse, domestic violence and truancy plaguing townships that are on the verge of breaking point. I mean, what can we do about it?
Well, we need to face some of these issues with a level of common sense as opposed to we need less acts of symbolism. We need more action, that's for sure. And we need to, when there are measures such as things like the cashless debit card, quite often when measures are brought in like this, the rest of the country jumps up and down and says that, this is racist because it's targeting Indigenous people. Well, Indigenous people in remote communities have a whole lot, as this paper has pointed out, a whole raft of issues that affect them dramatically. So you usually need, drastic sort of measures to be able to deal with some of these issues. And instead of it being based on, the arguments being, these are racist measures, and the argument being based around race. We need to make it about the problems that exist in these communities and how they need to be targeted with common sense policies.
All right. The other issue, of course, alcoholism. I mean, we know the Indu card and having money that won't buy alcohol and just essential items is hopefully going some way to solving some of these issues, but there's still a major problem with alcohol, isn't there?
Oh, alcohol is a huge issue, and for traditional Aboriginal people, you're not culturally, you're not really encouraged to do things like speak to a counsellor and go through, a process, a mental health sort of process. So these sorts of things, it's about education as well, understanding that there are other ways to deal with these problems. And because a lot of Indigenous people in these communities will simply just go about their lives, not thinking that there are, there's services that can be accessed. And I know in terms of substance abuse and alcohol, services need to be a lot stronger, particularly in remote communities as well.
Yep. There's always conflict. Jacinta, I'm not telling you something you don't know. There's always conflict around January 26. We saw last week with the, I guess, I don't really like using this term, but it exists, virtue signalling from Cricket Australia, wanting to disown Australia Day, if you like, and others have come out and done similar things in the past and probably will in the future. But, I mean, that does not address the problem. It's simply, it makes for a couple of feel-good stories. But, I mean, ultimately, if Cricket Australia were really concerned about the issues in remote and Indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities in Australia, maybe they might send some players out there or funnel some money into these communities to improve their lot in life.
Absolutely. I mean, they could fundraise to improve rehabilitation, to
yes.
Start a rehabilitation centre in some of these places. Do something practical as opposed to attempting to appease, a very vocal minority through these ridiculous acts of symbolism that mean nothing and go nowhere in the end.
I mean, they do. You're absolutely right. It's symbolic. It's feel good in a way for these organisations, and I understand that probably, in fairness, some people do it with, all the best intentions of the world, but it doesn't solve the problem. And the problem here is very clear in your policy paper. I mean, I'm going to go through the whole thing today, but just thumbing through some of the stats on crime, in particular by postcode, the areas that are, most affected by alcoholism, domestic violence. It's just awful reading. It really is. I hope the Prime Minister and those in high power get to read this report because it's brilliant.
Absolutely. And, I mean, over all these years with the billions of dollars, $33.4 billion spent on Indigenous disadvantage year in, year out. It's not just the government's responsibility in terms of, trying to do something about these issues, but also the organisations that have been funded year in, year out to create change. It's their responsibility as well. So accountability needs to be shared across the board.
Just before I let you go, Jacinta, are you still disappointed the term Invasion Day is being invoked? Look, the ABC have mentioned it, but it seems to me this time every year we have different media organisations going at loggerheads over, after each other, etc. That's all a distraction. I don't want to get caught in all that white noise, but obviously it's a term that is bandied around, Invasion Day. I just think it's ridiculous. What does it mean?
Yeah, look, it doesn't have any meaning for me. And, of course, there are those who will view the day as they wish, and that is a choice that they have. I mean, they're privileged enough to have that choice to think in that particular way. I feel as though we have one day in our year where it's for everybody. There are 11 days for Indigenous Australians and a whole week called NAIDOC Week for Indigenous Australians for recognition. And this is Australia Day is the most popular day for people to become citizens, to make this place their home as well. This is about them and the lives that they've built here. And some people come from really, really devastating circumstances, from war-torn nations, to make this place their home. And it's an insult to them that they don't have the opportunity to celebrate on this day because others want to jump up and down and use the term Invasion Day. And, you know, it's the day back in 1949 where we all became citizens of this country and no longer British subjects. So it is significant in that regard as well. But it is a choice that people are making to call it Invasion Day, to focus on what they think the day represents to them. But don't impose that on the rest of Australia. Let the rest of Australia do what they want to do.
Always good to have you on the program, Jacinta. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you again soon, I'm sure.
You too, and happy Australia Day for tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacinta. Jacinta Price, Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs and also from the Centre of Independent Studies. Look, I urge everybody to try and get a hold of this policy paper, Worlds Apart, Remote Indigenous Disadvantage in the Context of Wider Australia. I think it's a really important piece of research in light of what we're always discussing on Indigenous issues.